So welcome to another session of the Abi for MP podcast. Today is a very special episode because we have a very special guest, Peter Welsh.
Hello.
You are the Green Party candidate for Wales and Mendip Hills.
Yes, thank you
Welcome.
so much to both of you inviting
It's exciting.
me. I'm really excited about it. I've listened to the podcast. I think I said that to Abi, and I was just very interested in the content and the tone of it. And yeah, I'm just so privileged to be allowed to come on. Thank you both.
We're genuinely really excited for it, and I think it's going to be a really interesting episode.
Yeah.
I didn't know whether you wanted to start just by telling everyone who you are, maybe a little bit why you're running.
I'm
with
very
Green Party.
happy to do so. So I'm Peter Welsh. I've lived in Wales since about 2008. I have 2 children in schools in Wales. I'm an NHS mental health practitioner, so I work in Bristol mainly. I've always been interested in green politics, and in the last couple of decades, particularly the Green Party. Last election, there was no Green candidate, and it's something that was really quite difficult for me, and I know other Green voters, that they had to make either a tactical vote or not vote at all. And it's not the only impetus for me wanting to stand as a candidate, but I would almost see that as a pivotal one. It's the one that made me tip over to being an activist to actually wanting to be a candidate.
Interesting, yeah. I think it's a lot of stuff we talk about on, we talked so far about on the podcast as well, is the options. That a lot of it, I know with my voting history, there's only been a few occasions where I've actually voted for the person or the party that I wanted to, and a lot of it has been tactical. So I think being able to feel active enough to join a party that you believe in and kind of work with, I think is really cool.
Yeah.
And so, have you always been a Green Party interest?
Yes, I think when I was in the sixth form, I looked at Labour politics, and again, that's back in the 80s, in the midst of time. But I think very early on in my sort of adulthood, I looked at the Green Party. It was quite embryonic then. It was in the 90s, it started to pick up a bit more sort of profile, but it particularly, I think we spoke earlier about when Caroline Lucas was elected in 2010. I remember staying up very late and early into the next day, wishing I'd booked a day off, which I hadn't. But I think I just managed to see that result, and I saw that it's just been such an important thing for the Green Party to be in Parliament for all its challenges of representation of a constituent. It was something that I think the Green Party needed. And without going onto the soapbox straight away, I know this is more of a general one, I do see the value in having more Green MPs after the next election.
Yeah.
I think there's a possibility that Labour will have a reasonable majority, and I think they would benefit from some voices from the Green Party. Not to be just speaking to a probably demoralised Conservative opposition. Lib Dems may have some benefit from this election. They might have some boost to their MP numbers, but I really hope that the Green Party have some margin and some MPs in the mix after the election.
Yeah.
I think, again, a lot of what we talk about is like a diversity of choice as well. That it's really important that people vote for who they want, and it's really important that there's representation for a vast array of people as well, in systems. The next question I wanted to ask was, what brings you here today, Peter?
Well, I actually heard, so when I looked at the other candidates, I saw you, Abi, and could see that your campaign was quite advanced. I saw the amount of doors that had been knocked, the professional standard of the website, just these things. It was very interesting to see that, because for me it was a steep learning curve even to stand as a prospective candidate and then to be selected in a competitive field to become it. So that was kind of, in a way, took some focus from what might be the thing afterwards. And I think, I can't remember, I DM'd your message to say it would be nice to come on the podcast. Having heard, and I think nice to meet you, the tone of it was quite inviting. I mean, I do listen to some other podcasts and to stir the pot a bit. This is more the national ones. I find a bit irritating. Some of them are after-timers, whether it's George Osborne or Alistair Campbell. You have these national figures that, they're doing very well out of it. But I think there's element of them just speaking about what they did was so great, and it gets greater every year as they advance onwards.
Like after the fact.
My
as well.
memory of it wasn't so great. George Osborne, was it so great what he was getting up to? I mean, political currency indeed. I mean, what, you know, he sits there with, and this frenemy stuff, I don't quite get it with Ed Balls and George Osborne or Rory Stewart. They kind of merged together. They're business partners in an extent.
It's interesting what you say about that, because I've emailed Rory Stewart and he has emailed me back. And in my last email to him, I said, look, instead of looking to the top, maybe you should look to the bottom. Maybe you should look at the grassroots stuff that's coming up through and interview some of those people on your podcast, because I think that would be interesting to people. A bit like what you're saying in diversity in Parliament with Greens. And because I think you're right. I think they do look straight to the top and they glamorise maybe a little bit about their careers. I think it's far more interesting to look to the future and what might be coming up through. He didn't actually reply to that email. I'm still waiting. Rory, if you're watching, get in touch.
So I think they're talking about the podcast as well that you mentioned there. Why was it important for you to have Peter on?
Well, Peter reached out to... I've created networks across the whole constituency, and I've created some quite strong networks in North Somerset with the Green councillors who are representing up there. And one in particular had emailed me about you. And then I think maybe you had met him or talked to him. And I think from the back of that, you had then contacted me. Yeah. And I was really chuffed that you'd contacted me. And you said, let's meet. And I said, yeah, I'm definitely up for that. That's all about what I want to do. So me, Jake and Peter met a few weeks ago, maybe 3 weeks ago, had a coffee. And then while we were chatting, Peter was like, well, I'd love to, I've watched your podcast, I've listened to your podcast, I'd love to come on the podcast. And I was like, oh, that'd be brilliant. Yeah, I'll chat with Matt. So that's how that happened. And for me, this is all about how politics should be. So even though we're like competitors, if you like, it still doesn't mean that I think we should definitely be respectful to each other in that process, even though we're sort of going for the same job in effect. There's no reason why we shouldn't be. And I would want that to emanate throughout politics to the core, really. So I think this is quite I think this is groundbreaking, personally, what we're doing right now. And I feel really good about it.
And what's groundbreaking about it?
Because I don't think you would ever get two competitors sitting in a room like this talking about their views respectfully. I think when I've watched it, certainly on television and in panels, especially going into elections or by-elections, it is very much about tearing another candidate down and slagging off the party, and it's all very destructive from my point of view. And I don't think it needs to be like that, and I certainly don't want this podcast to be like that.
Are you suggesting that we should have the PMQs on the podcast? That we should hold Parliament here?
Why not? No, I mean they've got a lot. I think they have got a lot to learn in the way they conduct themselves, and yeah, I would hope that we can do something cool from this moment on. But let's see.
It's very interesting because I think when I have the idea of politics in my head, it is essentially, it feels like a warring system. That it's like trying to disprove the other person, or badmouth them, or like, what's the word, poison the well or something like that, like when someone's talked about. So it seems kind of like anti-politics almost of like what I know of like the collaborative aspect of it. And I suppose it'd be interesting to find out from both of you what is so important about collaboration in politics. Maybe Pete, you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think without it, it becomes that adversarial thing, doesn't it? I mean, you mentioned PMQs, I look at that and it's almost through my fingers. I can't really bear to concentrate. I mean, over Gaza and some of the most crucial things that are happening in our recent history, let alone perhaps for posterity. They were walking out of Parliament, the Speaker is not able to control it. It seems to me almost a macho culture, and I'm not perhaps using the word just macho in its more traditional sense, but a kind of way to be strong, you have to be really kind of beam out your views and transmit modes. And I think it's not my personality. Even if I tried to go into that, it wouldn't really be authentic or that meaningful. And I sometimes look at Parliament, and there's 600 plus of them, and they're all on transmit mode. No one's really listening. And if it's the party whip, or whether it's just their own ambition, something's amiss. They're not working in collaboration or cooperation. And the ones that have got that in them to listen, they've probably lost it.
Yeah.
They probably went into politics with good intentions.
Yeah.
And again, that, you know, it's very easy to pontificate this side of it. It'll be interesting if any of us have the opportunity to be tested in that
of course.
forum. Who knows? And that can be in local politics as well.
Yeah.
I think integrity and values, it can be tested in the most severe way if people are attacking you, for want of a better word,
Yeah.
if they're challenging you and what you've said. It can be, you can go into defensive mode. And I think without cooperation, it just won't bring change.
Yeah.
So there's compromise sometimes in that. So you can be an idealist as much as you can. At some point, there are compromises to be made.
Yeah.
But they shouldn't be at the expense of your value system, or, for in my case, the Green Party have certain sort of green lines, for want of a better word. They wouldn't really go into a corporation if it was something harmful to the environment, if it challenged the biodiversity, if there was something. And again, I don't go into party politics. It has been, not that long ago, a coalition government took place.
Yeah.
And the Liberal Democrats were part of that, quite enthusiastic. I do wonder if that cooperation proved to be quite harmful to them as a party.
Yeah.
And, you know, that a start-up crew of this current government, in my way of thinking, it's something which has its downside as well. Cooperation has to be a parity of esteem. It shouldn't be one that's very much dominant and the other kind of makes up the numbers.
That does come up on the door.
Oh,
so,
yes.
Yeah, a lot, because obviously that was in 2010 and we took a Liberal Democrat seat in this constituency, and they formed the coalition in 2010. And I think many people who voted in that election for the Liberal Democrats felt very let down, that they had reneged on a lot of their promises that they had made going into that election. So I think it was harmful for them as a party.
What felt, so from on the door, what are people saying? What felt from Lib Dem voters, what felt really harmful about it?
One in particular was the student fees. So they said that they obviously were going to protect that. They didn't want students to pay fees. And of course, through the coalition, student fees were introduced. And there, I've door-knocked some people in their 90s who are like, look, my grandchildren were very affected. They were very excited about the Liberal Democrat manifesto. They voted for the Liberal Democrat, and then they went back on their pledge, and they were like not only upset by it because they went back on something that they had promised, but also financially, there was a massive financial implication. So it's very difficult. That was difficult for people, I think.
And does that, regardless of the party, having that kind of idea, and then almost the difference of collaboration and compromise in a negative sense, when you compromise your own values, does that feel dangerous for voters?
Well, I think they felt very strongly about the student fees, didn't they, the Liberal Democrats going into that election? So it did kind of feel like they were going against one of their own
core values.
Possibly. So then that begs the question of, well, how meaningful is a pledge or a manifesto in the first place?
Interesting.
Because if you are going to renege on something that you have said is very important, what else are you going to do that with? And I think a lot of these, from that elections and subsequently, a lot of those sorts of questions have arisen where people are like, we have trusted you with our vote and you have gone directly against what you said you're going to do. And that's been a problem. That's a problem.
So there seems to be an interesting point of collaboration, yes, negative compromise, no, and then also maintaining some sort of integrity for the voter base as well. I think delivering on what you say you're going to do.
Yes, because they have placed their vote in you for that reason. And there's a lot of trust going on there, isn't there? They've put their vote in you, they've elected you in, you've got in, and then you've broken the promise that you have made to them. So there's a betrayal there, isn't there? So like you say, if you went against your core values as a group, that would be massively destructive to your party.
I mean, you sometimes hear about voting records, and sometimes MPs will say, well, they don't use the term whipped, but they effectively were. So they might have their own value base, but because of a party line, they've had to vote sometimes against their own principles, you get a sense. But I personally don't see that as an excuse, and the Green Party don't operate a party whip system. So Caroline Lucas, when she makes statements in Parliament, of course she's influenced by the party. It's not a case she's completely free, but we're not under the same whip system that...
I didn't know that.
I didn't know. That's very interesting.
That is interesting.
Yeah.
And that indeed, if we are successful with some more MPs being elected, they themselves won't be subject to it.
So that's a principle that you've already set out in your party?
It's not in the manifesto currently, but it's just something which is established. So I see
didn't
no
know
reason
that.
why it's going to change. And
Yeah,
I think that puts them, again, there are some party mechanisms in place, so I can't say that they can completely do it as they like and say what they want. But in those crucial votes, they can vote with their conscience and with their principles.
Yeah.
That's really important.
It's very
important.
interesting, yeah.
And so I think we've kind of talked a little bit about, maybe a lot about collaboration in terms of coalitions when parties do get into power.
Mm-hmm.
What does collaboration look like when parties aren't in power and working together?
And they're trying to get power?
Yeah, I mean, you tell me.
Power?
Is it, because one party being in power is, I suppose, potential like ultimate goal, but then there's also then all the other parties during that time who aren't in power.
Yeah.
So what does collaboration look like for those who aren't in power?
It's a good question. Have you got any thoughts?
Well, again, it's discussions, it's communication. If each party has their own silo and they're frightened to come out of it in case they kind of give precious secrets away, then that won't work. I'm not sure, do you mean in local government? Do you mean in a case of, I'm interested when you say not in power, do you mean however still in the political realm, I imagine? So, I think
for me, automatically, probably the way that my political view works, I think of the big picture, and I must admit I do forget about the smaller parts of it. So I think it'd be interesting to hear both sides of it, really. If you have any thoughts.
Well, I have one thought about the question. So we call it the leader of the opposition, don't we? So we have, the Conservatives obviously took a majority in 2019 of, I think, 80 seats majority. And we call the Labour Party then the opposition, and we call Keir Starmer the leader of the opposition. And I think that term is too heavy, actually. I think accountability is good, which is why they are there. Like we have the shadow ministers in the cabinet. But it seems to come at a very high cost where they are then just undermining everything that the government is doing. And they are opposing everything that the government is doing. And actually, I think it's good that they are accountable, but not that they are undermining and attacking. And I think that very language that we use means that they go straight for the kill all the time. Yeah. And I think there are certainly policies that they unite on and they agree on. So we need to work on those and find a way forward rather than just saying, well, you came up with it and you're Conservative and I'm Labour, so I'm just going to destroy it.
I mean, I could offer an example as well. I agree with a lot what you said there, Abi, but in the London Assembly, so that have Mayor Sadiq Khan, who possibly will get a third term. There's a mayoral campaign at the moment. But I've observed that the Green Party and other, Labour politicians have contributed to the debate and challenged the mayor over, for example, I think there's a lot about a tunnel in the east part of London, Silverdown Tunnel. And I watch a lot of these debates. I think it's because I was originally from London. I've maintained an interest in that whole way that London is governed. And that's obviously a major city, in some ways comparable to a small country. That's why I'm interested how politics work. But the Greens there have challenged Mayor Khan, but they've also supported him. So if there are green initiatives, and it's controversial about ULIS and these different schemes to try and minimise the traffic pollution, they've supported. Do you know what I mean? They haven't always had that default, that's it, it's a Labour policy. They bring out the best in perhaps the mayor, but they also deal with the worst. They don't just keep a party line, check the book, right, we disagree with everything that's Labour, everything that's Conservative.
That's interesting.
And they're not in power, you could argue, but I think there's a soft power there, and it's not always that soft. It almost visibly, when I watch the debates, it seems to be something that allows a mayor the chance of a wider dimension of thought, rather than his own advisors or his own party sort of gurus. Whether they fully get what they want, who knows? Maybe compromise does come in.
I think there's some really interesting points there, and it kind of harks back to where we were talking about listening as well. And if you're only, like you're saying, if you're only in your own silos and you're only listening to these same people, especially if it's a silo which has to conform to a whip or does conform to a whip, you're only going to have one sort of set of voices, essentially.
Absolutely.
So then being able to have a wide variety and be able to listen and pick out all the good bits, which is kind of what we talk about with the campaign, isn't it? That what does Abi for MP stand for? It kind of choosing all the best bits, and why not?
Well, interestingly, Matt, just drawing on that, we have a group. So I'm not in a political party, but I do have a group around me of a strong core group, and there's about 7 of us. And actually, individually, we've all come from a different political hemisphere, haven't we? So we've got traditional Labour, definitely Conservative, and some more neutral. I would say I was more neutral. So we are, even in that small arena, we are feeding in from different political entities from our backgrounds. And I think that's strong. If we were all coming at it from one political faction, it would become too dominated by that narrative. And I think when you're talking about collaboration and cooperative working and working cross-party, you need to have that ability to listen to every single person's voice and then try and find a way to move forward.
I like what you were saying earlier about the soft power as well, because I think there is an idea, certainly that I have, or maybe it's going now, maybe that's a good thing, that the power comes from the top, and it kind of trickles down, or that's where control is like hopefully kept by the people who have it, essentially. And I was kind of wanted to talk about, because obviously as an independent, it's a small party, and the Greens aren't one of the biggest parties. So what kind of benefits come from being a smaller section of politics, if that's an appropriate way to put it?
Well, I think you've already identified one with the whip, so you've already decided that as a party.
And also policies as well, because again, manifestos, so often these promises are broken, and not even ashamed of it. It seems to happen.
Almost a given sometimes. You should expect it.
The Green Party have theirs democratically chosen, so they're at conference will have the policies discussed and debated, and it's very much, I get the sense that party leaders, they have to accord with the membership's wishes. It's not the other way around. And I can't help myself but comparing that to perhaps Starmer's Labour, where the party discipline is pretty strong. In my view, it's all stick, no carrot. It's a case of, and again, the Green Party are getting some benefit from that. They're getting very, I think, committed and powerful individuals and politicians that are starting to gravitate towards a party with more democratic ethos at play. But also independents as well, because again, independents can cover a wide range of politicians, and indeed you're one of them. I think it's in the North East, Jamie Driscoll, who's very much on the left of the Labour Party, is standing as an independent for mayor in the North East, and there is a real power in that. And it was Owen Jones. He's kind of lumped to Greens. Maybe he knew about this podcast. Maybe he predicted it. About that people, in his view, and again, I'm very much into Twitter and X, was saying that people should vote for their independent or Green candidate.
Well, he's very strongly saying that now, isn't he? So
and that's a development from someone who formerly was very much Labour, on the left of Labour, but very much a Labour stalwart. And
Yeah, I think so. You feel like you've got quite a lot of autonomy in your own narrative, or how you can represent the constituency, rather than being heavily dominated by your party.
No, but again, maybe it's because I've chosen them and seen the development. They do accord with my values, so it's not a kind of bolt-on. There is that synchronicity there, and of course that could remain open to change. So if there were certain directions taken, then obviously we'd have to make decisions regarding that. But I think I said to you guys when I came earlier that I went to the launch in Bristol yesterday, and just so of the things I was hearing was really ringing home or ringing true to me. It wasn't a case of, well, I don't like the sound of that and that. And again, there'll be many people they don't, and I respect them. Do you know what I mean? I'm not saying that has to be a groupthink. Everyone agrees with them. But for me, myself, I'm confident, and I can be quite contrary. I'm not someone that just easily goes along with it. And I'm not saying I'm looking for it, but do you know what I mean? If someone could find things to sort of grate, it would be perhaps me. But because I kind of have that confidence, I think it does give a freedom of a sort, and of the fact that you agree with your party. I sometimes feel a bit sorry for some of these politicians. I see some of the Labour spokespeople and the Conservative. They just look so miserable when they're on television.
Because then they're
They've got
pushed,
Kay
aren't
Burley can play havoc with whatever statements they pre-prepared and their
Exactly.
phrases. And as I said, I didn't come with any notes or anything. There's a slight terror about
Yeah,
that.
of course,
Even though
yeah.
you're all wonderful people. But I'd rather that than have some diktats that I have to
Yeah,
say.
I know
Because
what you mean.
their dignity, I don't know, at some point, I
Well, they
genuinely
look
feel sorry
silly,
for them on a
don't they?
human level. It doesn't matter what side of the spectrum they are. I feel a certain amount of sympathy in the human level of the rubbish they sometimes have to spout. You know?
Because they, like you say, it's such a limited framework of their response, and they're pushed very heavily by the interviewer.
Yeah.
But of course, they're only authorised to say that limited response.
Yeah.
They can't actually authentically deliver a line that comes from them or comes from the people they're representing.
Yeah.
And I think that's extremely difficult territory. So it's great that the Greens don't.
Yeah.
I love that. That's
But
brilliant.
media coverage is important, isn't it? Exposure. And I think for your campaign and my campaign, I think you're more advanced than me. Our campaign is much newer than yours.
Yeah.
We would, and I think we're making it ourselves with this sort of podcast, need some exposure. And it sounds like you're pushing for that. You're trying to make your message known beyond the doorsteps, which are crucial, but also in local and in even national media.
Yeah,
That's a challenge, and whether it's soft power or however it's done.
It's a huge challenge. So when I ran for Somerset as an independent, what I learned from that experience was that you will get an automatic number of votes just from your party ticket.
Yeah.
So you're going to pick up however many it is. Now for the Liberal Democrats and the Conservative in 2022 Somerset, in this area, they all picked up 680 votes just by being in that political party. So it made me, and I would have won that election if I had been in one of those groups. So it made me realise, okay, if I'm going to push myself as an independent, people have to know who I am, because I don't have an automatic so many votes because of my political party.
Yeah.
So I'm starting at zero all the time.
Yeah.
So I've got to pull in the extra. So that's one of the downfalls of it. One of the benefits of it is that I can knock on anybody's door and I don't need to find out how they're voting, but my message actually is quite universal to all of them.
Yeah.
Because they can see, as what we've identified, a very divided parliament that is not able to work collaboratively, that is not respectful, and people don't like that. In fact, they're incensed now, I would say, and they want to see something different. And I think you're right. I think having a certain number of Green MPs in and a certain number of independents and diluting that very strong narrative that is in Parliament right now can only be a good thing.
Yeah. I mean, the appetite for change. I mean, I'm sure every election people talk about change, and I've seen it in decades, people don't. But I think it really is this election.
Yeah,
if there was ever a time after 14 years of this government to want change, and wider than just the political parties.
Yeah.
But again, of course I would say that, because I'm outside of those main two, that binary choice. Voters don't always know exactly the full extent of, I'm sure, your policies or my party's policies, but they do get a sense there's something different, a kind of different sounding thing, and they can make their own decision at the ballot box and make that choice. And it's just very much an interesting election, and not just because my involvement. I think if I was outside this, I'd be looking at this election thinking I can't entirely predict it.
Yeah.
So I do think Labour are likely to possibly have a good majority, but there's some intangibles in there. Labour themselves are under some pressure in many seats.
Yeah.
I'm just interested, area by area, how will it all play out?
Well, in this area, we don't have a Conservative candidate. We don't have a Labour candidate. And when I've door-knocked people and told them that, because a lot of people don't know, they're like, oh, really? We don't have a Labour? No, you don't have either, actually. And they're like, oh. Well, actually, I wouldn't vote for either of them anyway. So many people say that to me because they're very incensed with both of them. But then when you add that information in, they're like, well, they haven't even bothered to select a candidate. I think many people would be inclined, those people, if they didn't know me and I didn't exist, I think a lot of people would be inclined to vote Green this time. So I have talked to one of my mentors, for example. He was a previous Conservative voter, and he said I'd be looking at Green. I don't think they put a candidate forward in 2019 because it was a snap election. So I don't think.
Yes, I don't know the whole reason. I remember literally looking at the ballot box. I saw the hustings and there was no Green candidate.
Yeah.
And then I wasn't as immersed as I am now.
Yeah.
And I just thought, what a shame. I want to vote Green. And particularly when Caroline Lucas, who very much is a figurehead for many people of what the Green Party represents, I could see her on national television, but couldn't vote for, of course not her, it would have been another candidate. We're trying to rekindle the party. I'm sorry, I don't want to overtake this from Green, but I'm trying not to, I won't give any dates, but we're trying to make the local party more active, because I think since COVID it has become much less so. So we're literally starting meetings in mid-April. But with a view of looking at local politics, it's not just a general election.
I can feel it.
Yeah, it's got to be sustainable. So it could be very much all around me. I'd rather the party did well locally and perhaps a benefit further down the line.
You're certainly having an impact in North Somerset. You've got a big presence up there.
Yes.
And I can feel it.
Yeah, so I visited them in Weston. We had a meeting there and could see the other candidates standing in North Somerset and Weston-super-Mare. And just the amount of people in the room who were, all ages, just talking about change. And not all of them were Green voters, I even got to say, but change. And they were impressed, I think, by the sort of range of Green policies that were being discussed.
Yeah.
But Green policies aren't just with the Green Party, and I'm not trying to open this up, but I think you were talking about sustainability in one of your recent podcasts. So I can see that there are other perspectives on what can bring environmental positive change or how climate change can be addressed. What I perhaps think many parties don't have is that it's got to happen. So societal and environmental justice is a kind of, it has to be core to the movement. It can't just be something, perhaps some parties are a little bit more, well, if we've got the money, we'll do it. If there's fiscal restraint, we won't. I think I'm alluding to the 28 billion or what Ed Miliband seemed to have receded back in the Labour Party, while Starmer seems less keen to me on green issues, or feels with his Chancellor-to-be that they can't fund it. So they're going to, later on, they're asking for trust that the climate can wait for the length of time it takes Labour to consider they have the money to do it. I wonder if the Earth is that cognizant of what Labour are planning. My suggestion would be they're not. And as a result, the jeopardy they're putting themselves and all of us and our families and our children and grandchildren, whoever follow us, I just think it's time for an environmental party, but doesn't just concentrate on environment, looks at society, looks at the NHS.
I think it all feeds into each other, though, doesn't it?
Most certainly does. You can't have one without the other.
No, because if we talk about sustainable housing, for example, that is good for the environment.
Yeah.
If we're looking at a development in Shepton, just up there. Now we have had a massive flooding issue in Shepton in January and February. Yeah. And if they put that development in and it's not done well, that will have a massive impact on flooding for the rest of the town. So when we're developing housing, good quality, sustainable housing, we need to think about the environment.
Certainly, yeah.
So we think we have to, they all link together in my mind. And when we talk about how we're going to spend our money and taxation, they only ever talk about taxation. They never actually talk about the budget. Who's drilled down into that budget and seen how much waste is going on in that budget? No one ever talks to me about that. You just talk about how much we're going to tax people to pay for the budget, whereas I know there is heaps of waste within it. Someone needs to drill down into that budget and look at it properly. And that feeds into sustainability. Then we can maybe be able to release the 28 billion that they need for their pledge, that they've now reneged on, the Labour government. So I think all of these things are important, and you do need to look at them all, because they feed back into the same. Yeah. And that's what politics is, isn't it?
Yeah. And I mean, I work in the NHS, as I said earlier, and it's very much a contrast, in my view, between the Green Party. When there were strikes, whether it's the junior doctor strikes or the nursing strikes, Green Party leaders have stood there on picket lines, whether they're speaking to them or full solidarity. The optics are there, they're there. But shadow frontbenchers, they're nowhere to be seen, or anyone that's worried perhaps about, certainly Conservatives, I wouldn't expect them to be there. But Labour in the past would be at picket lines, they would be advocating for that kind of fighting for a health system under enormous pressure. They're absent. They don't want to be seen as a party of protest. I think if we can't protest now, at this time in our lives, in political terms, when can we protest? We're just going to say, right, the status quo has got us here. Let's look forward to whatever is ahead of us without protesting about the things that are wrong.
Yeah, I think there's so much to be kind of what both of you are saying there as well. So much to be said for solving like the root issues. Like everything else can act as like a plaster for so long, but unless we get to the root issues of social housing or the NHS healthcare systems and the environment, it's not sustainable either, and it won't last. And I think there's definitely something, and I think that's where the collaborative part has to come in again, of where, I know we talk a lot about it, but listening to the experts rather than listening to potentially where it might be most advantageous to win an election, or a lot of it becomes lip service. And so wanting to drill down and actually solve the solution at the root cause.
Yeah.
There's a question I think that you've kind of touched on already, but the appetite for change I think is really palpable. And I'd like to know a little bit more about, do you think something's going to change here? Because I can see Labour and the Conservatives talking about them being oppositions, but now it feels like they're potentially doing exactly the same thing.
I mean, I don't know what your perspective is. I feel like neither are here. So our current incumbent, James Heapy, 2 weeks ago said he's not standing. He was selected a year ago. He was online to be the candidate, and he's now stood down. So we don't have a Conservative candidate. We don't have a Labour candidate because the Labour Party has said it's a non-priority area for them.
Oh, interesting.
They've released that statement. So they'll, again, well, the Conservatives are really scratching around now for somebody that they can put forward. And it's a bit of a poison chalice, isn't it? Because their party is not polling well and they've got a terrible reputation. And they've lost 62 MPs who aren't going to stand in the next election, including our one. Who are they going to put forward? And the Labour Party, again, they've not been very present ever in the Welsh area. Who are they going to put forward? And why haven't they selected their candidate? So, yes, it is definitely going to be interesting because the two main runners nationally are not here.
Very interesting. And I think it comes back to this. It's felt like for a long time you have two choices. You stick with what you want, or the next best bet is to tactfully vote and get something else out of the way. Whereas now, personally, it kind of feels like it's opening up as like, we can actually choose who we want to vote for. And I know you talk a lot about, again, within the campaign, and I've heard you talk about on the door, you're not trying to win people's votes, and you want people to vote for who they think is best.
Please.
Because tactical voting, you could argue, has taken us where we are today. For decades, people have gone down that cul-de-sac of thinking, right, we've got to get the Tory out, come what may.
Yeah.
The Tories are getting themselves out, like you say, 60 plus. There's, and it's fun in a way to pick off these lame Tories. I'm sure and there's powerful people behind tactical voting. I look at figures I greatly admire, such as Carol Vorderman and many public figures that are saying, right, we must get rid of the Tories. And all, I kind of wonder if it's a lot of it is out of anger, it's out of revenge, it's out of fear. And I've been subject to all those. But whenever I've made a decision based on revenge, and it's never worked out well for me. And I wonder if there's going to be a bit of voters' remorse here. So say if the tactical voting campaign works in effect, and I'm sure they look at Wells and Mendip Hills as Lib Dem, that's the thing to get rid of the Tory.
They say that to me on the door.
I just wonder if that's missing. We're going to give Keir Starmer such a huge majority that we're going to have a whole host of other problems of a large party majority. So are we just going to have another type of that? And we talked about earlier, some of their policies aren't that dissimilar. There's a kind of gravitational pull between them there. So, and again, that kind of tactical voting, it hasn't got us a great government. So in a way, tactical voting's been done in our constituency before in Wales, but it's a new constituency, but what's the former Wales one? They just pass it backwards and forwards, Lib Dems and Tories, backwards and forwards it goes. And then they had a nice time in coalition government, and the electorate punished them. They punished Lib Dems very severely. And I do notice in any literature I read from the Lib Dems, there's no mention of their time in coalition government. I don't know if it's just an omission. They don't have space on the leaflet with some of the more negative things that they put.
To the 14 years
well,
that they weren't part of.
But again, they were part of the startup crew. I'm using that phrase. I used it in a speech I gave last week about that startup crew. You know, in a way, having been tried and tested in government, the Lib Dems could argue, if they had a reasonable time in office, that was a good grounding to give them trust again. I think it's actually the opposite, and that's why they don't feature it in their literature. And I think it's a bit rich when they attack the Tories with such gusto that they were very much, you know, Nick Clegg and Cameron were in the Rose Garden. They were all very, very pally not that long ago. In recent history, they were in coalition government. And I just wonder, are they a little bit too malleable, the Lib Dems? We talked about values and all that. Are they really able to look the electorate in the eye and say, we are going to stick to our values? What happens if there's another coalition government? Are they themselves going to be subject to those kind of temptations just to shapeshift, to fit into another government?
Yeah, their narrative in all of the leaflets I've seen and correspondence and bits and bobs that I've had from the Lib Dems, their narrative around we must get the Conservatives out is very strong, and your only choice to do that is to vote for a Liberal Democrat. And that's kind of where the narrative ends. So it's like, okay, but what next? So you've laid that out, and people can identify with that, especially right now. Even Conservative voters can identify with that. But you haven't laid out what is next. And I think the what is next is very important. What does that look like? Because we don't just want to carry on in some vein that we're on right now, just with a slightly different, you know, political party's name to it. I think people do want a whole different environment, really, where we can look at our government and feel pride rather than embarrassment.
I mean, something that would greatly help is a more fair system of voting, whether it's PR, proportional representation. And my view is Labour have no interest in, even though their membership, it seems, wants it, they don't want that to be in place, because I think Starmer or whoever's in charge in Labour in the future don't want to kind of jeopardise their hold on power. Because Labour could have power for quite a few elections ahead, the way the Conservatives are dissolving in front of our eyes. In my view, proportional representation would be vital to increasing the mix of political voices and parties. Without it, we are struggling. Again, it's a struggle that Abi and I are, from different perspectives, you know, engaged in. I think anyone voting tactically for Labour are perhaps misadvised if they think that will lead to a more fair voting system.
I think one part that comes out of this now is that people are desperate as well. Like, this has gone on for a long time, and I think people do just want change and don't necessarily know who to vote for. So I think it's really interesting with both the Green Party and Abi's campaign. There's one thing here that I think is really important, is like an authenticity, because I feel like a lot of times within manifestos there's a pledge. How often is that kept to? We talked about it earlier. It might just be an expectation that no one keeps to it. And I think there's something in here where this is a really interesting time where actually we can kind of take a step back a little bit and go, let's all recognise and work together to see what things we actually want to see versus I don't want to see that, therefore I'm going to vote that one in. Yeah.
And maybe that's a great focus, rather focus on what we want to see rather than what we don't want to see, because I think it is very much the negative dominates kind of everything, really, doesn't it?
Yeah, and I think from both of what you've said today, collaboration is key. Listening to each other is key, especially outside of your own potentially social group, political group. And I think everyone wants a better world to live in.
Yeah.
And so I think it's an exciting time that maybe we can get it in. I think this has been an incredible conversation, and it's an interesting, how nice, civil, collaborative conversation have we had.
It's been great.
Thank you so much, all of you.
Pleasure. Well, I think maybe we'd love to have you on again, and we can see what's been going on in the future.
Cool.
Well, there's going to be the hustings ahead,
and
I watched those before, and I did see a lot of adversarial, and it just would be interesting to see how that plays out now in this political climate when we get there. And that's the uncertainty we all have. When is the election going to be?
Yeah.
So I'd like to have that date, of course everyone would, but it'd be interesting to see how our principles and values stand up to campaigning. And I'm including myself in this electoral, because there are challenges. There's that feeling of desperation of wanting to do things, but it's just having a bit of political composure. And I think I can see that in Abi, and I aspire to that myself. There is that political composure that isn't always evident in other parties. So if we can maintain that, I think that would be a positive thing.
Thank
Love
you,
it.
Peter.
That's okay.
Well, thank you everyone for listening, and we'll be back soon with another episode.